My name's Vanessa Toholka. I'll be your host this evening. On behalf of the City of Melbourne, I respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Boonwurrung and Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation, and pay respect to their elders past and present. Welcome to Melbourne Conversations, the electric vehicle revolution. If you're not expecting to hear that title, maybe you're in the wrong room, but I'm hoping that people who care this much about transport options have a pretty good sense of direction. Feel free to come down the front, there's plenty of seats. This conversation is part of the Melbourne Conversations series, run by the City of Melbourne on the third Wednesday of every month. You can submit questions in the spirit of conversation throughout the event, and you can even upvote other people's questions if you get involved by going to Slido, so sli.do, and entering the hashtag electric vehicles. Or you can use the link and the QR code that's up here, and that will get you there also. Might require a bit of zooming, possibly me moving my big head out of the way. Just a bit of logistics. Exits are where you came in at the lift wells, and to the left, just outside the entry doors, is where the bathrooms are located. You can also browse the library pop-up that we'll have available after the event for specially curated selection of items that you can borrow with your library card, or you can even sign up to the library card first and then borrow if you need to. We're fortunate that this event is being translated in Auslan by our colleagues Glenda and Wendy. The event will also be available captioned on YouTube after the fact. So let's get started. Is everyone comfy? We've got the final people ferrying snacks into the room. Love that. Good. For many of us who have petrol cars, they might be our last. We hope they might be. Electric vehicle technology is accelerating alongside the rise of renewable energy. So what might this change look like in our cities? I'm Vanessa Toholka. I'm a Senior Product Manager at Allen's law firm in Innovation Team, and I'm a broadcaster of Triple R's Byte Into IT. I love everything technology, and I'm particularly energised by what's happening in this sector. Tonight we bring you an expert panel to help us navigate the opportunities electric vehicles open up, what we need to do to unlock their potential for everybody. So I'll let them introduce themselves. First of all, we'll go to you, Mahdi.
Thank you, Vanessa, and welcome, everyone. I'm Mahdi Jalili, Professor of AI and Electrical Engineering at RMIT.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming along this evening. My name's Helen, Rowe. I lead the transport team at ClimateWorks. We're a not-for-profit organisation embedded as part of Monash University and spend a lot of time translating evidence into action for policymakers and business sector as well.
Hi everyone, my name's Dave and I run a small business over in Williamstown where we build electric vehicle conversion systems, primarily for old classic four-wheel drives, so to try and make sure that there's not just new high-tech cars, but I mean it's high-tech on the inside, but classic kind of Australian cars, I guess you'd call it, out on the road as well.
There's a lot to unpack for each of our guests, and there's so much to unpack in this topic as a whole that we'll really be working to cover a lot of ground today. And by providing some forums for you to ask questions, hopefully we can also get to issues that are really front of mind for you. Let's start with electric vehicles. Is our audience vehicle with the acronym EV? If we refer to those all night, it might save us a bit of time. Excellent, I use that a lot. And while we might speak about cars a lot, we could also be talking about buses, scooters, bikes, and other electric-powered vehicles, so let's keep that in mind. So I thought we might start with you, Helen. What do we know about the current penetration of EVs in Australia?
Well, we're a little bit behind, shall we say, the rest of the world. So I think last year we had uptake, and this is in terms of new car sales, less than 2% of new car sales were EVs. So we're seeing a little bit of increase, but off a very, very low base. To compare this globally, we're seeing other countries increase quite rapidly. New Zealand's put in place a bunch of policies recently, have seen their uptake skyrocket. We know that countries like Norway are well over 70% of new car sales being EVs. So we're a long way behind the rest rest of the world. We've sort of set, so ClimateWorks has done some analysis of different pathways, so how we want to align in terms of climate change impacts. So our 2-degree pathway sort of set a target of 50% of new car sales being EVs by 2030. So we're not quite on track to reach that, but we have seen a bunch of state governments take up that target of 50% new car sales by 2030. Where the world is heading, which is be better off if we align to 1.5 degrees of global warming, because that will severely limit, we're talking about floods just before this event started in Victoria. So if we want to limit some of those really major impacts of climate change, our modelling suggested that more in the uptake of 76% of new car sales by 2030 is kind of where we need to be at to be in line with that kind of modelled outcome. So we're a long way off that, but seen recent moves in the right direction in Australia to start turning that around.
There's a lot of data in this sector, and there'll probably be a lot of little bits that we try and unpack. There was a study by the ClimateWorks Centre, which you work for, which showed Australians could save $19,500 on running costs over the 15-year life of a vehicle if they have the opportunity to purchase an electric car over an internal combustion engine, an ICE, which we'll use a little bit maybe, vehicle. What factors influence those sort of savings?
Well, you just know they're going to be, any of us have had to fill up their petrol tank recently, you just know how costly petrol is, and some of our modelling has been done before even the recent increase in petrol price. But really, if you're lucky enough to have solar, it's going to be even cheaper than what we've sort of assumed in our modelling there. But the cars are going to run longer. We know that the annual maintenance fees are going to be lower. You don't have the wear and tear. There isn't the traditional engine, so you're not going to have the same kind of wear and tear, and your fuel costs are much, much lower than they would be for an internal combustion car or ICE vehicle as it's known for short.
So Dave, you're in a position where you're often speaking to people who are looking to get an electric vehicle, in your case often a conversion. But in general, what sort of factors are you hearing from them that are influencing their interest in getting an EV?
Yeah, so it is conversions that we do. So we take an old sort of 60s, 70s four-wheel drive and, restore it and convert it. But most of our customers are actually people coming to us and saying, I would just like one to them, new car, please. And we source it and convert it and hand the keys over to them like it's a new car. So I feel like a lot of the considerations for those customers are similar to them buying any other electric vehicle or any other car really on the market. They're in the position that probably a lot of people here are in, I know I'm in, where I don't ever want to buy another ICE vehicle. But for a lot of people, you look at what the cars that are available, the EVs that are available, and while they might be SUVs now and a few different options, they're not four-wheel drives as we'd understand them in Australia. They're not utes. They don't have that true off-roading potential that some people, if you're on a farm, you might need, or even just actually we were just talking when you arrived and you've got to go through a little creek crossing to get through to where your horse is. There's a lot of people in Australia who have to do some kind of off-roading in a real sense to just get about their normal lives. So there is no option on the Australian market. And while we can all get excited about like Rivian and Cybertruck and these other things that may or may not come to Australia in the next few years, there's nothing on the market. So these are people who are like, I want to drive sustainably. I want a vehicle that represents me. And I think a big thing for us is we try and make beautiful cars, and you can't get away from the fact that for a lot of the market, a car is like a piece of clothing or an accessory. It is very much a style decision as well because you're spending a lot of money. So it's a practical thing, but it's a style thing, and it's a utility thing. So if we can wrap all of those things up for someone, we can present them with an option that is currently not available. And that's, like we were talking about before, one of the biggest things is where's the supply and how are we going to be limited as Australians in achieving our targets?
Yeah, I guess supply is the number one issue at the moment. So we've seen some really good things happen in Australia, often at sort of state level at the moment, things like subsidies to help you buy a new car or things about charging infrastructure going in, but fundamentally you just can't get your hands on one. So instead of seeing, for example, there was some articles about this when Hyundai put out its next year's worth supply, sold out in 8 minutes. These car companies that have EV supply or are supplying EVs in Australia have long lists of people wanting to get their hands on one, so we just don't physically have them. So I guess the critical thing to understand in Australia and around the world is that we're operating in a global market, and the major thing that helps bring supply in is most markets in the world. I think it's Australia in the company of Russia that doesn't have this in place. Not the greatest company to be in at the moment, but is basically having something like a fuel efficiency standard. So basically this says to a manufacturer, if you're supplying a range of different vehicles, some of them might be four-wheel drive, some of them might be smaller vehicles, over that entire vehicle supply, you've got to average out to a certain amount of CO2 per kilometre. So you can still supply bigger cars, but there's more incentive. If you're going to meet a target, there's more incentive for you to supply electric vehicles to make that target in place. So Europe, America, New Zealand, I said majority of the world have something like this in place. They may have penalties if you don't meet that target. So again, the global supply of EVs is going to this market, and if you make the target, you might be able to sell your credits onto another company that is struggling to meet their target. So there's kind of a market created there. We don't have that. So what we hear from the manufacturers is we'd love to send vehicles to Australia, but the reality is you don't have any regulation in place. So there's no incentive for us to send them there, but we're going to get stung if we don't send them to another market. So we'd love to send them to Australia, but I don't have any incentive to ask head office to send any of the supply to Australia. So this is the very low base that Australia's coming off. We just want to get our hands on some.
Mahdi, you were nodding a little there. What does your research lab and your experience tell you about fuel efficiency standards as an issue? What do you think we should be considering?
Yeah, thank you. So there are some data on the emissions of EVs. So there's a data 3 years ago, I believe it was UK data. They did a very extensive study. What they found was that EVs, if they are charged from the grid, which we know that grid is not 100% renewable, correctly, if they are charged from the grid, their whole life emission is 3 times less than the average. This was Nissan Leaf EV. We have even more efficient EVs these days. It is 3 times less than average conventional car. It is 5 times less for Norway, since Norway's grid is more from renewables. So if we have 100% renewables, if we charge our car from our solar at home, it would be much, much, much less. So I think there is no discussion. We have to have EVs for the future. If we want to save our environment, if we want to have less flood, if we want to have less catastrophic bushfires, or at least if we want to keep it at this level, we need to have solutions like EVs. They have much less pollutions, much less emissions, and they are superior cars. So they have electric engine. It is much better if you drive an EV for your next car. If it is more expensive, you would buy EV because that is much, much better car.
It's very easy to say if it's more expensive, you'll get an EV, but low-income people already tend to buy cheaper cars, and often that's cost them in terms of access to safety features that other people take for granted. But now we think that, there's a risk they'll pay more in maintenance over the life of the vehicle and lower fuel economy because they can't afford a higher upfront price tag. What do we need to make access to EVs more equitable? And what do we need to bring the price down, which is clearly, the main lever to try and exercise there?
Maybe I can comment on this. We need to learn from other countries. We need to keep the prices down, like what Norway is doing. They are providing good incentives. I guess the government has some options like tax. They can lower the tax, like the luxury car tax. We can provide some incentives like what Victorian government is providing. We need to do more. For example, the Victorian government is providing incentives for household batteries. EVs can also do the same. So they can support the grid. They are battery. They are much larger battery. Usually household battery, standalone battery is just 10 kilowatt hour or 15 kilowatt hour. An average EV these days has 70 kilowatt hour, 80 kilowatt hour, 5 times more capacity than household battery. And still, the government doesn't provide that much incentive for EVs, which can support the grid. I might say that EVs have a facility, some EVs have a facility called vehicle to grid or vehicle to home. You can use the battery, you can charge the battery It is not available yet in all models, but there are models in Australian market like Nissan Leaf, like Outlander, Mitsubishi Outlander. They do have V2G enabled. So you can charge your car and then you can discharge it back to your home, or even if it is aggregated, it can be discharged back to the grid when grid needs it, and you can participate in market mechanisms, which is run by Australian Energy Market Operator. So it can really support the grid. It can help to have 100% renewable penetration in our suburbs. So it has enormous benefits, and these are some sort of things that the government can provide to make EVs cheaper. If you don't make EVs cheaper, our uptake will not go up. So the only thing that other countries did to make the uptake higher was to make EVs cheaper. So we need to make EVs cheaper in order to encourage people to buy them.
Helen?
2 points. One on the kind of vehicle as an energy source. I think there's some exciting things in this space. Think about if you're a tradie or whatever going out on the site. You may not have to find a PowerPoint for your tools. You might be able to plug into your truck, like if you're working on or you're on a farm. That's a pretty exciting, I think, development that we have thought of for some of the advantages here. On the equity front, I think it's important to think through, this is going to be a slow transition through the total fleet. So the target I was talking about before of 50% of new car sales being EVs by 2030, still less than 30% of the overall fleet. So a lot of us, I've never bought a new car in my life, but a lot of us are going to be waiting for those cars to flow through. So I think in terms of equity, it's thinking through where, even if a battery is cheaper or an EV is going to be cheap, but many people don't ever buy a new car. So it's finding also ways of flushing them through the second-hand market. So one thing that's I think is really important at the moment is things like large fleets being given incentives to take on EVs. It's a great way to get your hands on and try out an EV, because I think one of the things that's a big important thing is people have concerns about them, but when they actually get to try them out, they realise they're not as scary as they think they're going to be. But also fleets are a key access to the second-hand market. So if governments or large businesses are turning over their fleet quickly and have incentives to send them into the second-hand market, that's actually another way that more people can get their hands on a cheaper vehicle.
So I think it's a really challenging thing, because this is the biggest transition in automotive in 100 years, and so we can talk about these theoretical things. Like, I guess I'm in a strange position where I can't afford one of the cars that we build. But so I drive a 2013 Honda hatchback, right? And I haven't bought a new car. So when can I get an EV that I can afford, right? And I think some people here might have seen the announcement from earlier in the week or last week when Good Car Company, who's a little startup started in Tasmania but do a lot of their work here in Melbourne, got $10 million and they of funding, and they bring in second-hand cars from Japan, EVs from Japan, and sell them usually as a group buy model into communities around Australia. So Japan's had EVs for a long, long time. It's one of the few right-hand drive car markets. This is a whole nother thing we could go into around why Australia doesn't have supply. It's like UK, Japan, us, Thailand, South Africa. There's not many car markets that want cars built this way. But anyway, they bring in cars that means you can get a second-hand Japanese car that's had very light use, is a few years old for sort of $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, which is still actually more than most people pay for a second-hand car. But like you say, it's going to take a long time for all that whole sort of market from brand new, novated lease, expensive car to flow through and the value to drop all the way through. And that's the other thing that we're seeing is that your 10-year-old now Tesla Model S, still a fantastic car, still got 80% of its battery capacity, maybe more. And that's great if you bought it, because you can look at that total cost of ownership and think, I've bought all the petrol I'd ever use 10 years ago, but it's a really nice position to be able to be in, to think that you can have that money up front to be able to do that. So I think it's going to be a challenging period, and hopefully we can see more things like import restrictions relaxed and all those kinds of things. But to your other point too, when you can, if you are a business, for example, and you can look at that as a tradie, for example, and go, we've had conversations with builders. There's a few B Corp and carbon neutral builders out there, and they look at what they're doing, and their only source of carbon emissions is their vehicle and an on-site generator. If you're building a off-grid property or something, you've got to run a generator. An EV can solve both of those problems. And with the standard battery in one of the cars we built, I think we did the calculations, and it was like charge one of your tool batteries like 500 times from the battery that's in the EV sort of thing. So there's hopefully ways that we can see, I think, big corporate customers, fleet customers, and that'll start having a trickle-down effect.
One last thing on the equity front is also just thinking flexibly about this. It is going to take a long time for this to come through. And so at the moment, just to put it in some context, so at the moment, transport is the third largest source of emissions in Australia, but it's not abating. So it's still growing. So at the moment, we're just trying to stabilise transport emissions, and as some of those other sectors start to make wins, so the energy sector, for example, transport's going to be the largest sector in not too long. Predicted to be the largest sector not too long in the future. So we also need to be thinking about what other options are there available, and maybe things like e-bikes, which again maybe not going to be an option if you live in a really outer suburban area or in a regional town, perhaps, but it can actually get you a long distance and can be a really low cost way of perhaps being able to get rid of that second car, or other ways to actually save you some money and also cut emissions now, rather than waiting for you to be able to get an affordable EV
it's
down
still
the
a
track.
very inefficient way to transport one human is 2 tonnes of steel and aluminium and lithium.
Exactly. And alongside that, I think investment in things like sustainable transport is still public transport, walking, cycling, and things like shared mobility, or looking at making things like looking with taxis and Uber, which are actually an important source, especially taxis have always been an important source for a lot of people in the community who don't drive. Looking at, they do a lot of kilometres, so what can we do to make all of those transport sources zero emission, and keep encouraging things like public transport. As someone said, public transport already exists. We don't have to wait to buy it. You can just stop driving and hop on a train if that's an option for you.
Thank you. I'm going to pause just at that moment to do some housekeeping. If people have come in recently, there are some seats up the front. If you wanted to come down the centre of the room and sort of feed your way out, there's some options. I just don't want you to feel like you have to stand the whole time. Feel free to come into the front row. I'm very friendly. I won't bite. Great. Thank you. If you've just joined us, and this is mostly for our video audience, so bear with me here. My name's Vanessa Toholka, and you're at Melbourne Conversations Electric Vehicle Revolution. This is part of Melbourne Conversations series held on the third Wednesday of every month, run by the City of Melbourne. You can submit questions throughout the event, and we'll answer some of them at the end. You can use the the QR tags here. You can go to Slido, so sli.do, and enter the hashtag electric vehicles, and that will take you to a place where you can put in questions. I'll get to see them. You each get to vote on other people's questions, so even if you haven't got one, you might just vote up something that you think you'd really love to hear the answer to. So that's a great way to get involved at the end of the session. All right, thank you. We were just getting to the interesting topic of, the transportation mix and how it's important for us to touch on a whole bunch of things. Mahdi, I wonder, have you been keeping track of what's going on in public transport options?
Before that, Vanessa, I should say that there is another space which is very interesting, that is corporate cars. So 40% of all new car sales in Australia are corporate. And we know that taxation, all that kind of incentives are very important. I think the government can fix it pretty easily and can make these corporate car sales cheaper. Usually these corporate cars, they are being used for 3, 4, 5 years, and then they are being sold as second hand. And that EVs can be sold in the next 5, 6 years to the other people, and that would be cheaper. If they buy cheaper, they'll sell it cheaper. So one way to make EV sales or EV ownership cheaper is through providing some sort of good incentives, taxation incentive for corporate cars, which is 40% of the market, is huge. So you said about public transport, it's very interesting space. We have lots of buses in our public transport system, and even in New South Wales is even more. So I'm not sure if you know, but Victorian government has decided that from 2025, all the new bus purchases will be zero emission, either electric or hydrogen. But I think it will be electric. Hydrogen is not there yet. It's not yet economically viable. And New South Wales, they have very aggressive target. From 2030, by 2030, all the buses, either new or old, must be electric. That is massive, that is huge, and these electric buses will have huge batteries. So the battery size currently is about 2.5 tons in each bus. And that is a huge battery, a 350 kilowatt hour battery. The current setting is that these batteries will be charged during nighttime, and then they will be used during daytime. But I think for the future, there's going to be a mix of charging, nighttime charging, daytime charging. And we know that nighttime charging is not yet clean, but still, if we know that EVs, e-buses are cleaner than conventional buses, even if they are charged from the grid. So I guess there is a very careful, there needs to be a very careful consideration here. It is a very good opportunity. With these buses can be used to support the grid. For example, school buses, they are not being used all the time. They are sitting there for a very long time and they have huge battery. If we charge them at 1 p.m., 12 p.m., when they are sitting there, and then after serving the school at 5 p.m., 6 p.m., 7 p.m. in summertime, that is the peak of the network. They can discharge their battery to support the grid. So they can both support the grid, but we need to do it carefully. If we don't orchestrate this charging, they can consume lots of energy, and that might push up the prices. So that will push up the wholesale price, and that will disadvantage people. So we know that we need to do that. We need to electrify our public transport buses, but we need to do it carefully, both from transport perspective and the energy perspective. They have to just work together to do it effectively.
So I think we're starting to talk about the grid here as well, but I want to hear ideas from other people on the panel about what Mahdi's been saying.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we're all very intimately involved and understand the concept of electricity and electricity use and all these things. I think to me, obviously the key is when we get to a point where nobody needs to understand any of that, because everyone having to, there'll always be a segment of the market, and maybe it's half the audience here, that has an app on their phone that's monitoring their home solar right now, and they're thinking about their energy use and doing all that. But when you get really mass uptake, it's when you don't have to think about it. It sort of reminds me, and maybe I'm going on a weird internet tangent here, but back in the day when you first had broadband and we were doing cable broadband that was over like the Foxtel cable or Ozstar or whatever it was, and if you tried to use the internet when everyone was like watching the football, there wasn't much internet because the bandwidth was out, and it's sort of like it was annoying, but eventually, the market and the government and everyone and all this infrastructure came in place. And now we don't have to think about that stuff anymore, unless perhaps you're at the end of a street and, there's a lot of people sharing your your fibre to the street kind of internet. So there's going to be these big infrastructure challenges that are going to have to be solved about delivering this amount of power. But I think there's going to be sort of cultural and habitual changes that happen and incentives at a personal level. So if you're driving to work, that your employer offers free charging when you park because they've got a big factory or office roof with lots of solar and they can offer you charging, and that's a good incentive. And, maybe you can't take public transport to work or whatever. But also maybe you don't have an ability to charge at home because you don't have off-street parking. So there's other equitable challenges involved in this too and how we solve that. But I think there's a lot of technical detail and understanding and conversations that we need to have. And it's important because we also need everyone in government to understand all these challenges so that we can work together so that that everyone for the next 10 years doesn't feel like an early adopter and can just live with an EV and it just works.
You're right. It's a terrible experience at the moment. We've got to design that experience better. So we had some modelling released by Boston Consulting Group recently that found electric vehicles, utes and vans specifically, will make up more than half of the light commercial vehicle sales in Australia by 2030. And over the lifetime of the vehicle, once again, they found that the total cost of ownership will be cheaper than having ICE vehicles. But when people talk about working vehicles, they're really concerned about the sort of weight tonnage that they're moving around, and often they're really concerned about the sort of distances that they're covering as well. What sort of assurances do we have in that space, or are we there yet for servicing regional Australia better or people with working vehicles better?
You're looking at me a lot, and I can talk about this directly. So we're building off-road vehicles, right? And the concept of what an off-road vehicle can do in Australia is pretty unique. We share a lot with sort of sub-Saharan Africa in that sense, in the way we want to use a vehicle, more than anywhere else in the world. And we have the highest per capita ownership of four-wheel drives anywhere in the world. So Victoria is an interesting place for that. We're quite different to, say, Western Australia, where, everything's 5 hours from Perth, and going camping means, 800 kilometres of driving before you even start your trip. So the answer is we're definitely not there. We're not there. EV batteries do not have that range. You can't do the huge long-range tanks that we make in Australia and people fit to four-wheel drives and get like 1,500 kilometres of range more out of a car. That's not happening, and it's not happening for quite a while. What is happening, though, is it's a lot easier to have a rechargeability in a remote area than it is to have a drum of fuel. And I say that not to make light of it, but literally if you're doing, say, the Canning stock route, the thing you do when you're planning that trip is you organise for someone to do a fuel dump and put 44-gallon drums of fuel, because no four-wheel drive, petrol, diesel four-wheel drive can do that right now. So it's actually easier to have a permanent, easier in a conceptual sense, to have a solar array and a battery that's there, and it's always waiting for someone who's travelling. And of course, any power point is an EV charger. Just depends on how fast it is. So I think there's an element of range that's always going to be a sticking point in Australia, and I think that we're going to be one of the last places in the world that has that from an OEM automotive perspective, they'll be dumping the last of their diesel engines on us, but we'll be wanting them, and some parts of Australia will definitely want them and definitely need them. But I think from the general, the most popular selling cars in Australia are a Hilux and a Ranger, like dual cab utes. Most of those will transition because they will very quickly be better. They'll be faster, which people genuinely want. They'll be able to tow more. They'll be able to carry more. And so that is an interesting thing. Batteries are heavy, yes, but so are modern internal combustion engines. And so with the vehicles we build, we find that we're depending on the battery capacity, we're plus or minus 100 kilograms, which is a lot, but it's a kind of a person. And we're talking about vehicles that have up to a tonne, so 1,000 kilos of payload. So it's within a range at the moment.
And I guess just to loop this into another area, which, an area where innovation has to happen, but also in freight. Like freight, this technology has not been resolved yet in the freight sector, but significant amounts of weight, and they have to come up with a solution in that space, which we know is not quite there yet. So there is actually quite a lot of innovation left to happen at that longer distances, heavier vehicle types, and they're looking in that area, everything from swapping out batteries to hydrogen might be the real option in that freight sector to manage those kinds of trips. Actually, even the same thing with buses. I think some bus routes based on the length and so there's some other areas that still need to be innovating, but we do know that those smaller vehicle types at the moment we can get them if we have the right policies in place, and we could be taking them up at a much more rapid, particularly in places like urban areas like the city of Melbourne.
There have been a few times in this chat that we've touched on the grid, the electricity grid. What changes might this transition to a much more EV-powered transport network require of us and our infrastructure in the electricity space? Mahdi?
Thanks for that. Just for one very short comment about the previous rural areas and regional areas. We have the technology, so we have super fast chargers, 300 kilowatt hour charge or even 500 kilowatt hour charger these days. So if you have a 100 kilowatt hour battery, which can travel up to 500, 600, Dave can comment on that. Easily you can travel 600K with that battery. You can charge that with the super fast chargers in 20 minutes, in 15 minutes. So the technology is there. If you have a market, if you have many EVs, even in regional areas, we will have these superchargers. So I don't see any problems from technology point of view. But regarding your question about the grid, so lots of things needs to be done in distribution grids. So EVs, we call it behind the meter. They are not controllable. We can't control that EVs. So you have EV owners, and then they control their vehicle charging, and the grid doesn't have much control. So we need to have good policies, good tariff structures for smart EV charging. This is something that will definitely happen in the next 5-6 years in order to encourage charging in cheap times, and even discharging through V2G when we need. We know that discharging the battery will degrade the battery. So frequent charge and discharge will definitely degrade the battery, but sometimes the benefit that you will get out of this is more than the battery degradation. So lots of things needs to happen in distribution grids. So in transformers, in local transformers, not in transmission. So I think what we are doing here in Australia, we are doing lots of things for transmission systems in order to support renewables. So for example, in Victoria, we have 6 renewable zones in regional Victoria, in Gippsland, for example, for wind. And for that, in order to transmit that to city areas, we need to have more transmission. But for EVs, we need to do more on distribution levels. So we need to upgrade distribution levels. But in order to do that, first, our distributors, like City Power in this area, they need to understand what EV means for them. Still, they don't have that much understanding. So they need to get good understanding of the charging requirement of EVs, and then they can decide what sort of investments that they need to do in the network. Whatever they do, they pass directly to customers in terms of network charge. So if they overinvest or invest where it's not necessary, it means that our energy prices will be more. If they underinvest, it means that the energy will be less reliable. So we need to have optimal investment levels, and that needs to be done by distributors. So we need to have smart charging. We need to have good level of investment to upgrade our distribution systems in order to keep both costs under control and the reliability under control. And this is something that we need to do in the next 5-10 years.
Thanks, Mahdi. We are going to open for questions in about 5 minutes, so get them ready if you have them. Amazing.
Can I just say something on that grid element? Just because we have a lot of people coming to us and talking about, can I put a couple of solar panels on my car and then charge the car that way? Which, yes, but not very much is the challenge. So the analogy we quickly use, and it comes back to that, cars are a terribly inefficient way of moving people around, and we really do need to be looking at a lot of other transport mechanisms. But a Tesla, for example, so a Model S, Model X Tesla that use their original batteries, which are kind of, this big. And there's 16 of those in a Tesla. And that gets the car, 600 kilometres of range. When Tesla sells you, say, a Powerwall, the battery that they do for your home, that has 2 of those batteries in it. And those 2 batteries will run your house for a day. And you think about the size of the solar array on your house that also runs your house for a day. The amount of energy used to move that vehicle is so huge that a small amount of solar that you could fit on it. And so I think that's the one of the misconceptions or misunderstandings is just how much energy it takes to fill up a car. But then the other thing is the charge times and amount of charging you've got to do. It's not like for most people, most of the time, they're not charging their car from flat. So it's something like the average Australian does 38 kilometres a day of driving or something like that, right? So you're topping up 5% of your battery each day, not 100%. And it is very much that feeling of having a phone and charging it every night. But I think probably most of us are depleting our phones a fair bit and we're not getting a few days. But you find that most people with an EV are getting a few days, if not a week out of it, because you're not doing a 500-kilometre road trip every day.
Nice. I'm glad you interjected with that. There was a lot of information. That's great. Hey, Helen, before we go to the questions from the audience, there was something I did want to mention. We were talking about how there's an opportunity for people to have a bit of a voice to government soon on this space. Would you tell us about that, please?
Yes, so I guess with the new government coming in, we've got new ministers and a new agenda. So I think it's worth, if it's something you're really interested in, it's definitely worth having a look. At the moment, the federal government is looking at pulling together a national EV strategy, and it's open for consultation at the moment. So if you leave this meeting revved up and wanting to have a say about EVs or EV policy, now's the time to do that. It's a very open document. They've obviously, new government is fairly recent, so they've gone out knowing that this is an area that people are frustrated with, particularly frustrated they can't get their hands on an EV, so they've gone out to the community with a bunch of questions. So if it's something you're really interested in, now's the time to have a say. We have, as I said, in recent years seen state governments try and do bits and pieces related to EVs, but some of the really powerful things that can shift EVs, like taxes or fuel efficiency standards, those things happen at the national level. So if it's something you're interested in, you've got the perfect opportunity to, on the way home on the tram, get your phone out and start thinking about a submission, or just talking to your local MP or someone else that you'd like to talk to about this. But these decisions are being made, right now in Australia.
Thank you for sharing that. And thank you all for asking some questions. We've got tons of them in here. So I'm going to go for those that have been top voted. Let's try that. What are the environmental costs of producing EVs, and what can be done to reduce these? Great question. Who would like to have a go at that?
Maybe I'll start and you guys can add in more detail. I think one thing to think about that I've found interesting in something that's sort of driving a bit of my work at the moment is to think about the different types, and I'm just thinking about emissions at the moment because obviously ClimateWorks, that's a big focus. But when we talk about emissions, we talk about often talk about Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions. So I'll go through these. So Scope 1 emissions is the direct emissions from the thing you're doing. So if a car, it's a tailpipe. What are the emissions coming out of the tailpipe? Scope 2 emissions are the sort of upstream ones. So for an EV or for a car, that's the if you're drawing power out of the grid, that is how many emissions are coming out of the grid. So what's the grid intensity? Scope 3 emissions is what are the amount of emissions associated with that, whether it's sort of the embodied carbon in the production of that electric vehicle or that battery, or other things you might want to think about in terms of embodied carbon are roads use a lot of infrastructure, and that actually has a lot of carbon associated with it. So, and even just sprawling of our cities, there's a lot of carbon associated with that. At the moment, when we're talking about emissions reduction, we're really just talking about Scope 1 and 2 emissions. But if you start thinking about Scope 3 emissions, you might think, well, as much as possible, particularly in places like the City of Melbourne, can we have, what's the statistic? Cars sit around in the driveway 95% of the time. We spend a lot of money on cars that we don't use very much. So particularly in inner city areas, if we can use shared mobility more often or share cars, that is a significant reduction in Scope 3 emissions. So it's the total emissions of those vehicles. And particularly when you think about whole other area, but autonomous vehicles, we want to make sure we're on a pathway that has the lowest total emissions, not just to think about, oh great, we've got billions of EVs or autonomous vehicles driving around. Incredibly inefficient from a transport perspective, but also not very efficient from a climate or environmental impact perspective.
I think you did a great job with that. I'm sorry, I'm going to move on in the interest of answering more of our audience's questions, and we'll let someone else have a go. I asked my apartment building about EV charging for my car park and seemed to get no answer. When will this become mandatory? Excellent question about accessibility, and I live in an apartment, so this is one that's for me as well.
We had my apartment building's AGM last night. This is very topical for me. Yeah, I think it's a great question. Look, there's two parts of this at the moment. There's discussion going on nationally about the National Construction Code. So that sets the standard at which a new building has been met. I think the original discussion paper that went out was talking about only 25% EV readiness. So there's been a discussion about we're all going to have EVs. They're not very long down the track. So any new buildings really need to be 100% compliant. So it's worth keeping tabs on that discussion. I know that's been pushed up as a result of some of the debate. But the other one's about retrofits, and we're not seeing, I think, enough in that space to, in answer to the question, we're not seeing a lot. We're seeing some specific programs with some money from some state governments to do some retrofits, but we're not seeing anyone that's tried to navigate anything with their owners corporation knows how challenging that conversation be. Sorry about that breaking up. But I think about things like solar, and we've done good things about helping, particularly with renters, being able to negotiate that with landlords and think about how that happens. So there's some tools there I think we can replicate around retrofits of EVs. Sorry, I'm hogging all the answers.
No, and I want to add, if anyone has a car stacker situation, which I do, I've only found one company so far that does provide charging facilities that are compatible with car stackers. We can only expect that these options will grow, but there's definitely a lot of people asking for these sort of services.
Yeah, and it's there. There's solutions there now because owners corporations, because I've dealt with this with my owners corporation as well, and we don't have EVs, but we don't have EVs because there's no charging and all those kinds of questions, catch-22s. But there's companies now who've solved the problem of, because often the power in the car park is communal power. How do you pay for that? All of these things. There is solutions. There's a bunch of, particularly someone like Jet Charge, Melbourne company doing great things nationally. They've got answers and they can come and talk to owners corporations for you.
This is making me feel great. Thank you for these excellent questions. Next one. What are Victoria's plans to move to a more sustainable, clean energy to charge all of these EVs?
I think Victorian government has, they have announced last year 6 renewable zones in Victoria. We want to have more and more renewables, but the key is transmission systems. So generating power on rooftop is not a solution. That's a very bad solution. So we can't accommodate rooftop solar in the distribution grid. So let's say you have 80% of the people in suburb in the same area generating 1 p.m. December time. They all start exporting to the grid. The transformer handling them, they can't support it. So you will have over voltage in that area. That's why Australian Energy Market Commission passed the rule that in some markets like South Australia, AEMO can limit your export to the grid. So what Victoria is doing, I think, is the right thing. So they are building huge renewable zones, offshore wind and solar in remote areas. But the key is to have transmission systems in order to transmit that to city areas, to the loads. I think this is the future, and we need to invest more in our transmission system. That is the plan that the new government also have. I think they announced $20 billion investment in our transmission system, which I support that. I think that is a right move in order to have more and more renewable generated for the grid.
I was just going to ask another question, which is, can that be offset by more